Yeah, I think we're right. A very warm welcome to all present here with us today. My name is Tathagat. I'm currently an MPhil student in the Faculty of Economics at the South Asian University, Delhi, and I will be the moderator for today's session. Before starting off with our introductions and Professor Wolff's lecture, I would like to put across some context why today this very moment is extremely dear to us. Situated within the context of what has been happening globally in the realm of economics curriculum, it is a rare opportunity for us tonight to engage in a conversation that would hope to challenge the current dominant imagery of the university. Beginning with the idea of the economics curriculum per se, we have been seeing how it continues to be mired in the mainstream orthodoxy of supporting and being supported by the capitalist system, leaving no room, no space at all for any alternative imaginations and worldviews. The state of the average economics curriculum today, devoid of any semblance of understanding of plurality of thought, epistemology, and implication, is not a sudden and one time jump. The curriculum, so to say, has been going through its own endogenous crisis over a long period of time. The specialists, technicians, and experts of our economic system, our economists, repeatedly failed to identify and learn from the crisis of 2008 and the pandemic of 2020. The particular inadequacy of the discipline in providing a satisfactory explanation to suffering people across the world has brought to the forefront this discourse of crisis in the modern economics curriculum. It has exposed, for those willing to see, the inefficacy and deliberate mystification of the hyped emphasis on sophisticated mathematical and econometric modeling as an objective and an end in itself for the adequacy of economic theory. This mathematical and scientific sophistication is championed often by its mainstream practitioners as a neutral mirroring of the real world, while they simultaneously fail to even ask if such a neutral mirroring is possible at all in the field of social sciences, which by their very definition are political and partisan. This epistemic crisis of the economics curriculum lays bare the ideological nature of mainstream academic economics behind the veil of depoliticized, scientific, and power neutral discourse. Professor Richard Wolff and others have always remained at the forefront of critiquing such a homogeneous idea of a monolithic understanding of political economy. It is from them that we have learned how the essentialist epistemology of mainstream economics supports the status quo and shapes society in a vicious circle, which then reshapes the very economics curriculum itself, embedded with all the hierarchy, power, and violence of the real world out there. This ideological power of mainstream economics completely sanitizes the entire discipline, emphasizing with confidence that there is only one correct way of doing economics. It is in this context that the work of Professor Wolff, among other thinkers, assumes significant importance. That is, in the recognition of a range of contending economic theories from neoclassical to Keynesian and Marxian, and their actual conflicting worldview of what our economic reality looks like. It is here that we discard the futility of calling one theory as being better than the other, but acknowledge the political and partisan implication of picking one theory over another. This entire idea of what the classroom and the university space is supposed to do, to acknowledge radical plurality of thought, is what motivated the founding of this independent student-run initiative, the Development Study Group, DSG, at the Faculty of Economics. The group started more than a decade back, being completely student-run and independent, where the students would get together and decide what to read and discuss that would foster critical imagination, often missing from the mainstream economics curriculum. The students at the Faculty of Economics at the South Asian University were fortunate to have inculcated this inclination for pluralistic thinking, most importantly because of the course structure, where we would read everything: Marxist economics, feminist economics, Keynesian and post-Keynesian theories, and the neoclassical turn in development economics with intense rigor. It was perhaps a rare place where we were fortunate enough to read texts like Knowledge and Class by Professor Wolff and Professor Resnick, several articles of Professor David Ruccio, among other such important works from the Rethinking Marxism journal tradition. Unfortunately, all of this changed, particularly a year ago, when Professor Snehashish Bhattacharya was arbitrarily suspended by the university administration amidst the massive ongoing student protests for standing up to his beliefs and refusing to apologize for the charges that the administration had alleged. Losing a teacher as excellent as Professor Bhattacharya was a serious setback for the students. But the silencing of heterodox and critical voices in the discipline of economics has remained a long-standing phenomenon. Incidentally, Professor Bhattacharya's doctoral supervisor, Professor David Ruccio, had also been banished, to use Professor Wolff's term, along with other heterodox economists at the University of Notre Dame years ago. As Professor Wolff had written in 2021 in an appreciation note for Professor Ruccio, these professors could not escape the crude repression imposed by most universities on dissidents within their economics faculties. In this context, I would like to wholeheartedly welcome Professor Richard Wolff for our lecture today. Professor Wolff is an American Marxian economist known for his work on economic methodology and class analysis. He is a professor emeritus of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs of the New School. Professor Wolff has also taught economics at Yale University, City University of New York, University of Utah, University of Paris-Sorbonne, and the Brecht Forum in New York City. Professor Wolff co-founded the journal Rethinking Marxism in 1988. He is also the author of several books like Knowledge and Class, New Departures in Marxian Theory, Capitalism Hits the Fan, and Understanding Capitalism, among others. We also have Professor Shahram Azhar with us today. Professor Azhar is Associate Professor of Economics at the Bucknell University, Pennsylvania, and has been closely associated with Professor Wolff's work. Before inviting Professor Wolff to speak, I would like to ask Professor Shahram Azhar to introduce us with the relevance of Professor Wolff's and Professor Reznik's work, particularly in the South Asian context.
Hey, everyone, and thank you very much, Tathagat, for organizing this amazing event. And hello, namaste, salam, adab to everyone, and wherever our voice is currently being televised and heard. I just wanted to say a couple of things about my professors, my teachers, people that I have learned everything from, how to think about anything in this world. The joke in Thompson Hall amongst South Asian students was that if Marx and Engels were reincarnated and one was born in Boston and the other in Ohio, they would be called Stephen Resnick and Richard Wolff. That's just a South Asian joke, as you know. But more seriously, I just wanted to say two things. Steve Resnick and Richard Wolff's work has enormous implications for our theoretical as well as our praxis in the context of South Asian countries. The first and the most important implication is for our conceptualization of class and non-class processes. It needs no reminder that one of the major struggles that every Marxist activist encounters in the context of these countries is that we suffer not only from the living but also the dead. And while bourgeois development economics has taken this route, formal versus informal labor, it's only through the work of Steve Resnick and Richard Wolff that their students, such as Rajesh Bhattacharya, Ian Seda, myself included, have developed a new understanding of all of those multiple class processes that we encounter in practice in these economies. So that's the first implication, how we conceptualize this problem that we're dealing with. And of course, we're Marxists. We understand that how we understand the world has an impact on what we're going to do about it. So clearly, it has implications for praxis. It needs no reminder that much of the orthodox left in India, Pakistan, Nepal, and other South Asian economies continues to suffer from this orthodoxy whereby, for the lack of a better word, there's a lack of distinction between state capitalism and private capitalism, which is the binary that seems to be constraining our imaginations. In contrast, Professor Wolff and Professor Steve Resnick pointed out to us, think about the surplus. Think about the surplus, who makes it, who receives it, who gets it, and to whom are the distributions made. Okay, I don't want to say anything beyond that. I'm going to hand it over back to Tathagat Singh, and hopefully we'll have an amazing session.
Thank you so much, Professor Azhar. We would like Professor Wolff to present for about an hour, after which Professor Wolff will be taking questions from the audience. We have received more than 100 questions for Professor Wolff through our event registration forms. We have tried to combine the questions thematically so that we can discuss as many ideas as possible. I apologize if the nuances of the individual questions get missed due to the time constraint for us. To all those who have joined us, you can send us your questions by writing them in the YouTube live chat option as well. I would now like to invite Professor Wolff to deliver the lecture on understanding capitalism.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by appreciating your kindness and your generosity in inviting me to do this. You are doing me a great honor. I appreciate it more than I can probably say. And I say it on behalf of Steve Resnick as well as myself. But I want to jump right in to give you, as best I can, the context within which I respond. And before I do, I want to say that the introductory remarks I just heard are really fine intellectual work already exhibited. I see among you, therefore, exactly what Steve and I hoped for, which is a new generation of young people able and willing to take what we did and go further, take it further, use it, build it. That's the best service and honor you can give us. And it's something that begins here today, and I hope continues beyond what we do today. The first thing to understand about understanding capitalism is the enormous change going on in the world today. Something that has become clearer in the decade that has passed since Steve Resnick died. What we are seeing and what is being reflected in the economics tradition, in the economics curriculum that we just heard about, is nothing less than the peaking and the decline of the American capitalist empire. It is following the British Empire into the dustbin of history. This is crucial to understand, particularly because the response of the United States and of Western Europe, and to some extent of all of its allies and client states around the world, the basic response is denial, the pretense that this isn't happening, that this isn't something that has to be dealt with. Instead, we have a proliferation of war, and I am not unmindful of the war that has just been literally in the last few hours extended beyond Israel versus Gaza, beyond Israel versus Hezbollah, beyond Israel versus Lebanon, now including Israel versus Yemen and Iran. These wars, like the one in Ukraine, are desperate efforts to hold on to an empire that is passing. Beyond the general denial in economics, there is a even more hysterical, in the Freudian sense, hysterical holding on to a make-believe that all of this isn't about the decline of the empire. Put aside the fact that the US dollar no longer plays the role in the world that it once did. put aside the fact that the BRICS alliance already is a richer collection of nations than the G7, the United States, Western Europe, Canada, and Japan. All of these developments are now going to work their destructive impact on the consensus around neoclassical economics. The profession dominated by neoclassical, which systematically excluded all other approaches here in the United States until the collapse of the Great Depression in the 1930s, provided once again the shock that allowed a little bit of Keynesian economics, so that the dominance of the neoclassical allowed for a junior partnership to be given to the Keynesians. And thereupon, as was commented in the introduction, the great debate, in quotations, of conventional economics was a debate between neoclassical and Keynesian economics over the private versus the state variety of capitalism, carefully presented and endlessly repeated as if it were the only significant debate economics needed to acknowledge. No matter how repetitious, how utterly tiresome, this continues to be the case. And the violent rejection of Marxism was replaced by almost equally violent hostilities between the neoclassicals and the Keynesians, some of which continues now. The Keynesians never recovered after the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. Indeed, one of the very few things that the Keynesians and the neoclassicals have always been able to agree on is the appropriate repression of the Marxian alternative. Steve Resnick and I were are products of all of that. We went through the most elite levels of training in neoclassical and Keynesian economics. My macroeconomics teacher at Yale was James Tobin. Steve's macroeconomics teachers at MIT were Paul Samuelson, Robert Solow, Charles Kindleberger. These names are probably known to you if they remain in your curricula. Those professors tried everything they could to persuade us, to frighten us, to threaten us into becoming reproductions of themselves. They tried hard. Some were subtle, some were crude. Some used incentives, some punished. But the bottom line was, it didn't work. They couldn't do it. In Steve's case, it was because a working class kid, which Steve Resnick was, simply knew from his own life the desperate struggles to survive of his mother and his father and his brother. He could see through what was happening to him. In my case, it wasn't that. it was that my parents were refugees, leaving Europe because of World War II to survive. But before that, my father, a member of the Frankfurt School, brought with him the traditions of Marx and Adorno and Horkheimer and Marcuse and all of that. And I was brought up to understand that there was a whole nother world of thinking beyond what was taught to me when I went to Harvard, because that was the place we were told you want to go to. They too tried to persuade me, as they tried to persuade Steve, but it was too late. They couldn't do it. And the result are the books and the work that now passes to you. I am persuaded that it is you, and I mean you now watching this video, who are finding for your own reasons and out of your own history, both national, regional, and personal, the strength to see through the dictatorship of neoclassical economics to a much more pluralistic, much more interesting, much more diverse, and much richer way of thinking about society. And the collapse of the American empire, which puts the whole capitalist system into question everywhere, will be an enormous stimulus and an enormous support to what you do, just as what you do will shape everything I've just mentioned. With that as a background, I want to take you very briefly through my latest book and ask you to consider reading it if you haven't, thinking about it. Let me tell you what inspired it before I go through it. I have spent much of my life working on and with Marxist theory. It is beyond words what I can tell you is the value of doing that. Even when it is difficult, when the language of Marx or Hegel or the Marxian tradition is difficult to understand, difficult to learn, and it often is, it's worth it. You will get ways of thinking lodged in your brain that you're only dimly aware of until years later, when they come back to help you think in an original way. That theory is a training, not only to do work in developing the theory, which Steve and I spent years doing to produce the very books that were mentioned so kindly in the introduction. But they have also led us, and especially me since Steve died, to try to apply them to the questions swirling in the minds of people about the changing world economy, the declining American empire, the rise of China, India, South Asia, and so on. And I want to stress this, the deepening question of against capitalism here in the United States. Without that, I wouldn't have written this book. Without that, you probably wouldn't have heard of me. Maybe you would have. But my work now, in the final years of my life, has been focused on trying to translate, to apply, to extend, to shape the emerging critique of capitalism so that it does not have to reinvent the wheel, that the enormous work done from Hegel to Marx and on is made available to those that need it now to finally take us beyond the capitalist system. Everything here is premised on the following idea: the human race can do better than capitalism. It is not the end. It is not the perpetual. It is not the always has been. It is none of those things. And it is desperately trying to hold on to get people to believe all of that. And it isn't working. The book opens, therefore, with a section that wants to get across an idea I can summarize with and for you as follows. The very words we use in economics mean different things to different people as we use them. The fact that the word is value in neoclassical theory and value in Marxian theory does not mean that they are the same. They are light years apart. And much of that is true for price and wage and interest rate and profit and surplus and many other terms. That's an epistemological sensitivity which does not exist, as was pointed out correctly in the introduction, in neoclassical economics. But it is urgent for us. So, for example, the New York Times, and no doubt many publications in South Asia, glibly refer to capitalism as a market system, or as a free market system, or as a private enterprise system. Strange language. Markets existed throughout history. Slaves were bought and sold. Does that mean that capitalism includes slavery because they had markets? Is that the point? Feudalism had markets too. Feudal manors were private in the sense that they weren't state. So were slave plantations. And where in all of that are the collective economic systems of villages, of ancient communities in all parts of the world, some of which continue now? No, the very idea of what capitalism means is a contested terrain. Not contested by the neoclassicals only because they wish their particular definitions must be the only ones. They live in the world of right and wrong, not in the world of different. That's why they have such problems with their racisms, their ethnocentricities, and all the rest. Marx's Capital begins with commodities. That's not because he agrees that commodities and markets are some sort of core reality of capitalism. In his correspondence with Engels, you can find the reason he begins there. He begins there because That's where people's thinking is in the Europe of the middle 19th century, to whom Marx addresses his work. They think economics is all about markets. And they do that because Smith and Ricardo focused enormously on those questions. And precisely because of their influence, and precisely because of Marx's respect for the many insights they achieved, you can see that if you read Marx's theories of surplus value, where his respect for them is on display in detail. No, Marx begins with commodities precisely to take the reader from what the reader is used to seeing, markets, commodities, exchange, prices, all of that, to a different topic. That's what the early chapters of Volume 1 of Capital do. They take the reader from the market economy to something altogether different. Something that goes on not in a market. Something that goes on elsewhere, carefully explained elsewhere, in production. In production, there is this exploitation whereby the labor of one group of people is embodied in products that are taken by a different group of people and used for the purposes of that different group. No such story exists in neoclassical economics. And it doesn't exist clearly in the classical economics either. Marx explains how to make it clear what is going on because it's muddy. It's glimpsed in Smith and Ricardo, but it's underdeveloped, and Marx takes it in another further direction. Why do I stress this? Because for Marx, then, capitalism is this particular organization of production, and an organization that's unique. It's when a small group of people, very small, are in a position to decide what to produce, how to produce, what technology to use, where to locate the production, and what to do with the output. A tiny group of people. They are also in a position to obtain the labor of a large group of people who are excluded from deciding what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the product. It is very, very interesting. A small group and a large group, and the one obtains the labor of the other. And how does it do that? By taking a portion of the product and using it as the way to pay a wage to the large group who have no power. What an array. That's not like slavery. Slavery, the people who do the work don't have a wage, don't get paid. They are themselves the property of the small group. In feudalism, there's a small group and a mass of people who have a personal obligation to the small group. Capitalism is not those. Capitalism has no slavery, and capitalism has no personal obligation. It's remarkable in capitalism how utterly unconcerned those at the top can become toward those who are their hirelings, because that's the only relationship. Everything else, as Marx says so nicely and poetically, everything else dissolves. All other linkages among people virtually disappear. You are hired, you do your job, then you go away until the next day when you come back, because you're hired to do your job. Everything you produce stays in the workplace. You leave. You own nothing coming out of your workplace. You will live on whatever portion of that those people you give your product to decide maybe to give back to you. And they will always try to give you as little as possible, because the less they give you back, the more they get to keep to solve all the problems of this way of organizing production. Capitalism isn't a market system. It isn't a private enterprise. Markets and private enterprises are as old as the human community. Capitalism is a very particular way that is only a few centuries old. It came into existence like all the other systems. It evolved over time like all the other systems, and it is passing out of history as we speak. No one should be fooled, is Marx's subtext. It hasn't always been this way, and it isn't going to. It's limited by time, and nothing is able to project it beyond its time any more than you and I are able to project our lives beyond the times we have to be born, to evolve, and then to die. The book tries, in simple, straightforward English, to explain what capitalism is and what it isn't, so we can begin to talk about it as this particular way of organizing production. Here's a footnote. The capitalist system, at least in the West, celebrates itself as having broken through the limitations of slavery and feudalism. In the minds of those who brought capitalism into the world, in places like England first, and then Western Europe, and then beyond, it's all about human freedom, liberty, equality, fraternity, democracy. Those were genuine hopes and dreams of the people who helped make the revolutions in Britain, in America, in France, and so on, that finished off slavery and feudalism. They were sincere, but they were wrong. Capitalism wasn't about to bring liberty, equality, fraternity, and freedom. They hoped it would. They wanted it to. They tried, but they failed. And their biggest failure was not being able to explain to themselves and to us who come later why they failed. But Marx did that. That was Marx's basic project, to explain why capitalism, which made a revolt against feudalism and slavery, wasn't able to deliver the liberty, fraternity, equality, and democracy its protagonists had promised. And the achievement of Marx was to show that inside capitalism are the reasons for its failure. It's not an argument that you can't have real democracy. Of course you can. Or liberty, or equality, or fraternity. Those are magnificent goals. They captured the minds of generations of people. They capture the enthusiasm and mind of Resnick and me, and likely of most of all of you. They're valuable. They're valid. Capitalism can't do it. Marx's argument. And here's the beauty of it. The reasons, as I'm about to give you examples, the reason capitalism cannot deliver what it promised, what its bearers promised, is because of that specific organization. What Marx sometimes used the phrase relations of production to talk about. The relation of employer to employee, the distinctive quality that makes something capitalist when we're talking about the production of goods and services. So let me give you some of the examples. In the book, they're handled as problems or myths of capitalism. The first one is the easy one: democracy. The people who made the revolutions that brought us capitalism, especially here in the United States, but in other parts of the world too, talked about democracy. They still do. They still try to market the idea that capitalism fosters democracy. The democracy they mean, initially, was the antidote to what feudalism had become. Toward the end of feudalism in Europe, it evolved the absolute states of Europe, dictatorships of kings and queens. Democracy was to be the parliament, the Congress, all of that kind of apparatus. Not the king, not the queen, not the czar, not the emperor. No, an elected parliament. That's what they meant by democracy. The idea of democracy, that anyone affected by a decision has the right to participate in making that decision. What was meant by democracy, if you go back over the millennia that the idea has been around. This we never had in the West. There is no such democracy. And nowhere is that clearer, and nowhere is that more important than in the core of the capitalist economic system. Inside every factory, every store, every office, I shouldn't say every, there are some exceptions, but the overwhelming majority of factories, offices, and stores are organized, as I said a few moments ago, a small group of people who decide what to do, how to do it, where to do it, and what to do with the product. They hire an army of workers those workers do not participate in the decisions that affect whether they have a job or not, whether they have an income or not, whether they can sustain their family or not, whether they can sustain the community that depends on their income or not. These are the most crucial decisions of a life. They don't control them. A different group of people, very small, control them. They don't elect those people. They cannot fire those people. The capitalist enterprise is the negation of democracy. Historians will look back on our period of history and scratch their heads that a society so fundamentally anti-democratic positioned itself as the champion of democracy. Wow. That takes a level of courage and self-blindness that no one should follow. Our democracy, political democracy in this country, and I'm talking now about the United States, is a farce you can witness right now as it takes extreme forms. Half our people don't vote. 3/4 of those who do make a decision based on 3 or 4 months of intense propaganda paid for and utterly disconnected from reality. What kind of democracy is this? We don't mean it really. What we have are popular elections that are manipulated in every way imaginable. The outcome of our presidential race now hinges, for those who understand it, on 2 variables. How successful will the Republicans be in preventing people from voting, which is where their major effort is now focused? And the other one, how much that helps the Republicans, and whether the Democrats, they have collected more money from more donors than they normally have been able to do. And the question is, will that enable them to literally overwhelm the propaganda paid for by the Republicans? That's it. That's it. But no question is raised, not one, about the capitalist organization of production. Nobody challenges that from the Republicans. Nobody challenges it from the Democrats. It is a system that doesn't permit any organized opposition to the capitalism once you understand what it is. Democratic, it's the last thing. No, going to work in a capitalist system is to be trained in accepting no democracy at all, because that's what you have when you cross the threshold into your job in a capitalist system for nearly everyone. Here's another remarkable quality of capitalism. Because of the structure of the employer and the employee, and by that I mean that the employees get together and produce an output, and the employer gets that output. Let's remember, the output of a capitalist enterprise is produced by the employees, and in the instant of its production, it automatically becomes the property of the employer. In a typical corporation, the major institution in modern capitalism, the employees may number tens, hundreds of thousands, millions in some cases. The board of directors, 10 to 20 people. They own the product, and then they pay out of the product a wage to the employee, keeping the rest. They do everything in their power to minimize labor costs. You know that all too well, particularly in South Asia, where so many of the corporations from the United States and Western Europe and Japan moved their production in recent decades to take advantage of the lower wages that they would have to give back to the armies of employees, keeping what remains for themselves. Another way to say this, they enrich themselves. And as Thomas Piketty, the French economist, has shown us over and over again, wherever capitalism settles, anywhere in the world, no matter what the time, it makes inequality worse. It is an engine of inequality of income and wealth. Periodically, the inequality becomes so enormous, having no intrinsic limits, that the mass of impoverished people blow up, explode. Then there's a period of redistribution, and once that is over, the tendency of normal capitalism to widen the inequality resumes. Elon Musk, one of today's multi-billionaires, is our modern emperor, our modern pyramid pharaoh of ancient Egypt, worth hundreds of billions of dollars, the obscenity of it. That's a capitalist product. It's not that other systems didn't produce inequality, but the idea that capitalism is somehow a cure, that the French revolutionaries who brought capitalism in 1789 could seriously have on their flags égalité, the French word for equality. They meant it. They wanted it. They hoped for it. But capitalism could not and did not deliver it. It delivers the opposite. Then there is the sinister, and I know no other word for it, the sinister claim made by people around the world, particularly today. Mr. Stiglitz of the World Bank does that, and many others. Poverty has been reduced in many parts of the world, and they want the credit to go to capitalism. That's an attempt to get around the way capitalism generates inequality. They want us to focus on the fact that those at the bottom, who may be even further from the top now than they were before, are still better off. Here's the answer to that horrible and ignorant claim. Every advance of the poor, every step to reduce poverty was blocked, opposed, and delayed by capitalists in the history of capitalism. If I had time, I would take you through, for example, the minimum wage. The minimum wage in the United States, just to give you the example, right now, as we speak, is $7.25 per hour. That's what it was the last time it was increased, which was in the year 2009. 15 years ago, and over the last 15 years, prices of consumer goods have gone up every year. But the wage for those at the bottom hasn't gone up ever. This is a savage reduction in the standard of living of people living on the minimum wage. When the minimum wage came into effect in this country in the depths of the Depression of the 1930s, it was opposed by the chambers of commerce. It was opposed by the Republican Party. So was Social Security. So was Medicare, our national insurance for people over 65. And so every improvement in the condition of the poor was won by struggles of the poor and their friends, socialists and communists, who got those things. The capitalists always opposed it, were usually able either to block it or at least to delay it for many, many years, like the minimum wage. They now want us to have an amnesia of the brain so that we don't remember, and they want to take credit for the improvements they obstructed. Don't be fooled. That could have been the subtitle of this book. A couple more examples, because I don't want to intrude on your time for questions. There is the ancient idea of risk. My professors like to tell me capitalists take risks with their money. Notice in Marx, the whole idea is the capitalists take the surplus produced by the worker and remove it from the worker, separate the worker from the surpluses the workers produce. They rip the workers off, or in Marx's elegant formulation, they exploit the workers. No. The neoclassicals want us to look somewhere else. They are taking a risk. They could have spent that money that they use to promise to the worker and gone on a vacation, but they didn't. They took a risk. And profit, far from being the theft of the surplus from the worker who produced it, is transformed into a reasonable reward for the risk-taking of our capitalists. If we had time, I would stop here and play an appropriate piece of music to set the mood. The answer comes from my parents. I watched it. My parents took risks for every job they had. They moved from one part of the country to another. They got rid of an apartment that was working well and took the chance of looking for one somewhere else to take that other job. They risked the disruption of my life as a child, yanked out of one school, separated from friends that were important to me because they had to take a risk of another job, not knowing whether if they took that other job, it would be there 2 years later, or that school might close or change. What am I saying? Workers take risks, but no one in neoclassical economics, to my knowledge, ever even asked the question. If the employer takes a risk and gets a reward, and the worker takes a risk, why doesn't he get a reward? Why does he only get a wage for his labor and nothing for his risk? Because the idea has nothing to do with analytics and everything to do with apologetics. Much of neoclassical economics, indeed much of Keynesian, is a matter of finding definitions, relationships among what you define as your key variables that apologize for the system, that mystify its ugly qualities and exaggerate its beauties. Remember the phrase, beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. Capitalists find capitalism beautiful, and they pay economics professors to persuade you to find it beautiful also. Economics is a brand and a variation and a form of advertising. No more, no less. The state, and Shahram mentioned it, a very few comments. In slavery, in feudalism, and in other economic systems, it is common to find enterprises, projects where goods and services are produced, that are run by state apparatuses, and side by side with that, private apparatuses. Private, if you want to call that, feudal lords with no position in any state had many serfs. But feudal states also had serfs. We could call that private serfdom and state serfdom, private feudalism and state feudalism. But no serious body of analysis said it wasn't feudalism if there was the state doing it alongside private doing of it. And the same is true with slavery. And the same is true, fill in the blank. Except when we come to capitalism, where we see a bizarre alternative. In capitalism, we're supposed to be deeply impressed with a difference that we do not find impressive in all those other systems. Side by side with private capitalists who hire employees, we have state enterprises who hire employees. That is, we have private capitalism and we have state capitalism. But we're supposed to think one of them is capitalism and the other one isn't. And the only reason given is because the state is doing it. Exactly what we do not permit with feudalism or slavery, etc. That's bizarre, but hasn't occurred to neoclassical economists to think about it or to worry about it. No. It is so exciting to imagine that the only struggle is between private capitalism and state capitalism, between the United States type of system and the Soviet Union type of system, that the very idea that what Marx might have meant in his work had nothing to do with that Marx never writes about the state, isn't excited about the difference between state and private capitalism, which he notes in passing, but without any attribution of importance, this hasn't bothered them either. The reason Marx spends all that time teaching us that capitalism is about a particular relationship between a few and the many is because the dream he has of something better than capitalism, socialism, for lack of a better term, communism, if you like, is that the whole idea is not, here we go, not the relationship employer-employee. It's not an argument about whether the employer should be private or state. It's the questioning of the employer altogether. It's posing the question, which is where Marx was going. It is where Marx wanted us to go. What about a system in which the employer and the employee are the same people? In which all of them, now the same people, together decide democratically what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the product, because it's theirs. There are no employees giving the work to somebody else. Democracy becomes embedded in the base of society. Workers who have that power, that position in the workplace will demand it outside the workplace also. They will not permit the horrible pantomime of democracy that we have here in the United States and by extension in so many other parts of the world. They'll demand the real thing because they will know what that means in the workplace, rather than have the workplace be a training ground for resignation for the absence of democracy, which is what it is now. I am persuaded, and here there's plenty of room for disagreement. I am persuaded that we are living in a world in which the private capitalist model of the United States and Britain is in terminal decline. A decline that fuels the falling American empire, as it is in turn reinforced by that falling empire. I am also persuaded that the alternative, a state economic capitalism, was what we had in the Soviet Union. And what we have in places like China and India are hybrids, mixtures of varying proportions between the two, managed by a powerful government, which you would need if you're going to hold on to your hybrid situation. You're going to have to prevent either one of them from removing the other. So you have a strong government or a strong political party or both. But I also believe that none of this, however more successful at economic growth those hybrids have shown themselves to be, and they have, none of them solve the problem of the contradiction between a capitalist arrangement of production, employers and employees, and social conditions that the mass of employees sooner or later will find unacceptable and unnecessary. For centuries now, we have had the dream of doing better than any society split between a small group and a large group. Masters and slaves, gone. Lords and serfs, gone. Employers and employee, gone soon. The next stage is being prepared for by the very failures, the inequalities, all the rest of it that capitalism now exhibits and that we can point to and build on. Thereby, we too help in moving us from a failing system to something that can be, should be, and hopefully will be better. It will have its contradictions. It will have its laws of motions. Maybe some of you will be those that help teach us what those are. Meanwhile, it is my hope that this little book and your interests will combine and take us another few steps in the same basic direction. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to questions and answers, but also hopefully in the future, more opportunities to interact.
Thank you so much, Professor Wolff. That was a fascinating lecture. I think we can begin with the questions now. We'll start with the questions that we had received through our registration forms. So this question is from Dhritiman Paul. So as we began with our session today, we have been seeing the erosion of public spaces that foster critical thinking, particularly in the discourse of economics education. Your latest economic update episode with Eleni Shermer and Sofia Apteker, where you discuss the financialization of public universities for Wall Street's benefit, also pointed toward the increasing encroachment of places of radical thinking by capitalist finance. Can you comment a bit on how intellectual spaces are increasingly being shaped by the forces of capital currently?
Sure. But the shaping is remarkably contradictory. On the one hand, the financialization of our universities closes the space for anything that might threaten the financial support. The more you make universities dependent in an ongoing, literally, week by week, month by month accounting, are you raising enough money in your tuition? Are you charging enough money for people who attend your athletic events? Will that be enough for you to pay the debts you have to the Wall Street banks that lent you the money to build the stadium? I mean, that's how this is working in the United States. So on the one hand, that means that the university administration cannot risk anything that might either damage the flow of revenue or make the lenders hesitate to lend. So, for example, I'll give you just one example that you'll find perhaps interesting. We have had a remarkable, in the sense that many of us, and remember, I was born and lived all my life in the United States. We have had an outpouring of sympathy for the experience of Palestinians in Gaza and the northern part of the Palestinian territory, the West Bank. We have had remarkable student mobilization in support of Palestinians. Okay? And this has frightened the universities where these demonstrations have mostly taken place. And they have had to react for fear that donations and even parents sending their children to these institutions will be negatively affected by the publicity. Some universities have therefore worked out with students, could you please do your demonstrations this way so they won't capture the local newspaper attention? Others have felt the need to expel students or have felt the need to call the police onto the campus to make a big show that they are. So this is constricting the space, for example, for professors and students to manifest their views about the U.S. support for Israel. Yeah, but here's the irony. The need for the communication, if it can't be done on the university campus, the students and the activists are looking outside the university for allies, for friends, for supports, literally for places to have meetings. And you are building relationships between communities and academic life that we didn't have before, that are very positive for where they can go. You know, this is a lesson in contradiction. It's a simple idea, but it's so hard to get people, particularly in the West, even though the body of work that taught it to me is Hegel, a German thinker who wasn't particularly revolutionary, except in the ways that he thought. Otherwise, a very stiff, old, German academic. But there's a reason Marx was a student of Hegel. That Hegel is in there all over the place. And he's in me too. And one of the things you do is you always look for the contradiction. You don't stop when you see how X has this impact on Y. You at least ask the question, could X also be having the opposite effect on Y? My guess is 95% of the time, you'll find it if you ask the question. You won't find it and you won't think about it if you don't ask the question. There I will quote Einstein. The question is what's difficult. Once you ask it, it points you in the. He meant, without knowing it, Hegel. The Hegel lesson means the minute you ask the question, the follow-up will be to ask about the contradictions. And the contradictions here, really, there are many. Give you another example. The competition for the United States. And here is an issue that I really hope you, and I'm talking to all of you now, take up. For 1 century, the American empire has been dominant. The dominant economic powerhouse in the world was the United States, the equivalent in the last 100 years of what Britain was before. Okay? For the first time in a century, the United States economy has a serious competitor. And that competitor is China. And you have to, if you don't understand that, you are missing something that is shaping everything else. And that competition, particularly in high tech, what we call here high tech everything, is squeezing the United States. It can't fund the way it did before. It can't do 27 things. It can only fund 21. And so which are the 6 that go? That's a central struggle in the politics here. It's the way austerity plays out here. And it includes cutting welfare payments and cutting everything, but it's also cutting wages. Our major airline company, Boeing, has 33,000 workers on strike. Yesterday, the East Coast dock workers who unload the freight at our Atlantic Ocean ports stopped working. Nothing's moving. You can't do it. The pandemic gave an excuse. The pandemic is over. Now the excuse doesn't work, and the workers want to catch up. And they don't know how to handle all of this. So but at the same time, they are trying to mobilize hostility against China. So yes, it's squeezing American capitalism, but it's also mobilizing. In other words, I want to give you it's hurting capitalism, but it's helping mobilize a kind of celebratory anti-Chinese. American capitalism has always needed an evil other. You have that in other countries too, but think of the United States. Europeans come here and they find a centuries-old indigenous cultures. They murder them one by one. They destroy them physically. But they refer to them always as quote unquote savages. In other words, they rationalize, they justify their ethnic cleansing by demonizing the others. It's what Israel does to Palestinians. Okay? But it works. It works to give the people coming in a rationale, a way of organizing their thinking to make themselves okay. They can continue to destroy the native people because those are savages. We are beauty, light, and progress. It's a very, that contradiction is very, very deep. But I would assure you that the power of capitalism now, which is significant, and I do not want what I say to be understood as it's not there. It's not a paper tiger. It's a tiger with very nasty claws. But it is also digging its own grave.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that answer. And related to the point that you made about China, we have one comment in the YouTube live chat by Kriti Singh. Recently, in one of your talks, you maintained that China is, in a real sense, the first competitor to the US. Yes. How do you view the rise of China amidst the shifting geopolitical landscape, the BRICS, NATO, and the global flows of finance and trade? How do you think this reshapes the classically thought notions of what is termed as imperialism?
I don't think we can answer that question yet. Partly, let me say this way. Every economic entity in the world is now in the process of changing its plans and its programs and its policies to take account of the rise of China and of the BRICS, the alliance. That's true of every major corporation in the world, and it's true of every country. They are trying to figure out how to change what they're doing. If they are looking for a loan, they're not just going to London and New York anymore. They're going to New Delhi. They're going to Beijing. They've got options they didn't have before, and they're trying to rethink their strategy. Every corporation is trying to figure out how to tap the Chinese market. It is the fastest growing market in the world, and it will be that for quite some time. And they have to figure out how to be there, because if they're not, their competitors will be. And that is a threat, an existential threat to them. All of them have to do this, okay? The only difference is how this is going to be played out. How is China going to take advantage of this situation? How is India going to do it? How are China and India together as the two big places who are making these decisions, either together or separately? I don't mean to say that Brazil, Russia, South Africa, and others won't have their input. They will. But the monsters here are China and India. And the question is, and I don't want to sound romantic. Here again is the contradiction. On the one hand, maybe China and India, separately or together, will try to become the next empire. The British had its rise and fall, the American had its rise and fall, and now we will see the Indian, or we will see the China. Or if I'm to be respectful of your history, another Indian empire and another Chinese empire, because you've had them before. You haven't had them global, but you've had them before. Or, and here's my hopeful sign, maybe for the first time, and I don't want this dismissed as romanticism, it isn't. After World War I, there was an idea called the League of Nations. It didn't work, but it was a good idea. After World War II, there was the United Nations. That was better than the League of Nations, but it hasn't worked well either. Okay, maybe those reasons were that in the League of Nations, we had the moment when the British Empire was taken over by the American. And in the United Nations, we had the problem that the British Empire fell apart and the United States filled the vacuum. Might it be possible? I think it is, that the Chinese and the Indians, separately or together, may for the first time be in a position seriously to create a global multipolar architecture that would fulfill the dreams of people around the world. You will have then achieved what the Western world was able to dream but never accomplish. I think that could happen. I think that could give you the prestige and the social position that everybody in the world will be grateful that you inherited what comes after the American empire implodes, which is where I think it's headed.
Yeah. So, Professor, probing you a bit further on that. So
Please.
we had a question on a similar theme. So when you talk about, this possibility of a multipolar world with China and India taking sort of the lead, we had a question about the understanding of class analysis for these countries. For example, so can we understand South Asia, or to talk at an even more abstracted plane, the global South as being capitalist enough? And if not, to what extent do you think Marxian economics fits the recipe for a diagnosis for the internal class dynamics of these economies? And how can class analysis be extended to these so-called diverse economies, as you mentioned?
Well, let me take a step back, and I hope this does not sound immodest, but we tried very hard Steve Resnick and I, and it has been taken further already in the pages of Rethinking Marxism and other work, including work on India that one of my students, Stephen Cullenberg, did together with several colleagues from India. Some of whom studied with us here in the United States, and some of whom, particularly at the University of Calcutta, but elsewhere, got involved. But we are only at the beginning. We are only at the beginning of a process of applying the notion of class that we distill from Marx to the United States and Europe, let alone the global South. That's a project early in its stages. I don't mean to diminish what we did. I don't diminish what has already been done. I know I've read this stuff about India, so I have some sense of it. But It's early. It's early. We need to do that work because, and by that I mean apply it. What are the class structures? I mean, we had I'm drawing on my memory now, but we had fascinating work done by an Indian student, Bhattacharya, but not a different one from the one you mentioned.
Rajesh Acharya.
Radesh, that's right. And one of the things he did that was absolutely, he lectured Steve Resnick and me about the so-called informal sector, that enormous part of Indian society, the people who, the street vendors and the mass of people who are not working in formally registered corporations. But they have a very complicated class structure. In Western and in other kinds of approaches, they are all given one class identity. They don't. They have a very complex class identity, as complex as any other social grouping typically. But that work has to be done. Other students took characteristics of peasants or sharecroppers or all these other categories of bourgeois analysis and now re-subject them. Well, who is producing a surplus? Who is getting that surplus? How is this being done? To do a class analysis is an enormous project that is at its early stages. What I can tell you is, and this is a promise, if you do the work, you will see as you do this work how it generates very different conclusions about what's going on in your society, including your politics, your cultural shifts, your migration, the big issues you want to contribute to, you want to have something to say about, but you have to do the work in order to, it's like you have to do the work to get the prize at the end. You have to. That's why I stressed it before. I am now, if what I have to say week after week, and remember, I do this program every week for a half an hour. And I do, by the way, dozens of media interviews on top of that. I do it because the analytical work of 20 to 30 years allows me to do it, gave me the way to say, oh, wait a minute, I have something to say about these things that's a little different. And I will tell you, based on my own experience, that even with the constricted conditions for Marxists and the left here in the United States, I have more opportunities to publish what I write, to speak what I have to say, than I have ever had in my life. This country is going through big changes. And one of them is opening up the space for Marxist interventions, even to the point that the places where I make them will call them Marxist interventions, and it's okay. That used to be impossible here in the United States. It isn't now. And I don't know how long that'll last. But there is an enormous opening of insights you will have if you do that work. But you must do it. You have to question the received categories. If you think in terms of, quote unquote, an untouchable, okay, stop. What is that? What is that community? What does it mean to be a Dalit? What different social positions do Dalits occupy in relationship to Brahmins or whoever else? As you think this through, be aware. That's why the epistemology is important. Don't be trapped by the word. Frederick Jameson, a man I worked with for a while, just died recently. But he wrote a marvelous book years ago called The Prison House of Language. And he was epistemologically That's why we had a relationship. We worked together. He was at Yale University when I was. So we worked on that. He wanted to teach people not to be trapped in the language of their learning, because that too has to be broken from. Marx took the words of Smith and Ricardo. If you read the theories of surplus value, he there will give you examples where he takes a word and he shows for the word how he repositions the word in a sentence in a way that opens up a whole new space.
Absolutely, Professor. So, as you talk about not being stuck with this and not having been a prisoner to received categories, we as students also had encountered your and Professor Resnick's concepts of entry points and overdetermination. So, related to what you were saying in this answer, I have a question in the YouTube live chat from Uditi. How do you see and understand the relationship between global capitalism with issues like gender violence, caste and racial discrimination, settler colonialism, environmental degradation, among other such phenomena? Yeah.
Could you say that again? How do I?
So, how do you see and understand the relationship between global capitalism with issues like gender violence, caste and racial discrimination, settler colonialism, environmental degradation, among other such things?
Well, for me, if I'm understanding the question, I would argue that I accept every one of those issues that you just listed there as an urgent, important issue of our time to struggle with. No question. Then the question then only becomes how? How do you do that? What the approach that I tried to develop with Steve and that others are carrying forward offers one way to do that. Not the only way, it's a way. The linkage I'm looking at, the linkage between class analysis and the concerns about gender violence, climate collapse, and so on. Let me give you an example so that this isn't quite so abstract. At a certain point in our work, the feminist movement in the United States really took off. And just to make it personal, both Steve's wife and particularly my wife got caught up in that struggle. And my wife still is. And we had to work out, as people who live together have to, these issues, because we were not immune in our personal relationship to many of the, I mean, I'm not violent, I assure you I'm not, but we had to work out all kinds of issues. The long story short, Steve Resnick, Harriet Fraud, that's her name, and me worked together, and we asked ourselves the question, could we understand the anger, the bitterness that women were bringing up into the realm of theory and history and psychology and all of the rest? Could we add something? Could we understand something? Could we contribute something using class analytics? And that was the question with which we began. And again, long, difficult story short, we ended up saying, here is something we have figured out. That the household where men and women live together, and of course we extended it, it can be men living together, it can be women living with children, without children, all that. But in the household, there is a production and distribution of surplus. The class analysis applies. It means that from now on, within the realm of those of us who've worked on this, Marxists doing class analysis can no longer do what they did in the first century of Marxism, which is basically focus their class analysis on the enterprise, as if what happened in the household was so different a realm that class analysis would have no direct bearing, maybe indirectly, but no direct bearing. That's gone. Marxists now, insofar as they take seriously what we did, and of course there are those who don't, but insofar as there are those who do, they now know that the analysis of capitalism means you analyze both its enterprise domain, if you like, and its household domain. So that if Harriet Fraad were sitting here now with us, she would insist about talking about how the current crisis of American empire is destroying the class structure of the household, the inherited class structure of households, which had worked out a live and let live relationship with capitalism in the enterprise. Even though you don't have capitalism in the household, you have feudalism, long story short. But there was a modus vivendi between the household feudalism and the economic capital. That has been destroyed because the household feudalism has been destroyed, and that is destabilizing all of capitalism. It's contributing to the empire's decline. Now, without the Marxian class analysis, you can't do that. You just can't do it. What you can do is you can see, divorce is very high. You can see that. You can see that women are not having children. That our birth rate has collapsed. You can see all kinds of interesting things. But what sense you make of them depends on what analytical apparatus you bring to bear. And I can assure you, if anything I've just said is interesting, it's because we made the effort to take the class analysis and bring it to bear on, in this case, a feminist question and a feminist revolution, which continues in the United States. Harriet Fraad is now speaking and writing about the collapse of marriage and the collapse of the birth rate. She's taken all of that further because, in part, it's such an urgent issue. And that includes trying to understand the violence, particularly the male on female violence.
Professor, just as a side note, I would like to inform you that we at DSG were really hooked by the title of the paper that you're talking about. For every knight in shining armor, there's a castle waiting to be cleaned. And we took it up as one of our key readings for our discussion last semester. And it was a fascinating session. Great work, of course.
There's a parallel. Women here have a parallel that they enjoy. And it goes like this. It begins when you sink in his arms, and it ends with your arms in the sink.
Yeah. Professor, you also talked about the kind of a dichotomy, forced dichotomy between what is assumed to be state capitalism and private capitalism. We have a question in the YouTube live chat by Ayush Majumdar. The critique that only a small set decides when one reads Hayek, one finds a very similar, if not the same, critique of socialist structures, that it kills choice and freedom. What is your take, sir?
Yeah, this critique depends on the notion that socialism is all about the government and all about the state. What Hayek did is tilt against the windmill. This is a Don Quixote problem. In his day, when Hayek was writing, the notion of socialism was embodied in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union made the effort. And by the way, analyzing the Soviet Union, which, by the way, Steve and I spent 10 years trying to do. We wrote a book called Class Theory and History, which is an attempt to understand, using class analysis, what happened in the Soviet Union, including its collapse. In that book, if you want the ideas developed a bit further, the argument is made that what the Soviets did, for a whole host of reasons, was state capitalism. We also offer a quote in that book from Lenin, in which shortly before his death, he recognized that the 4 years of the Soviet Union's existence at that time was summarized in his words: we have created state capitalism. Now we have the job of moving on to socialism. Okay, Hayek didn't get the message. Hayek never read that speech. Hayek was a sworn enemy of everything socialist anyway. So for him, he didn't understand the argument because, okay, if you're angry about a small group of capitalists controlling a vast army of workers, then why aren't you equally upset about a small group of bureaucrats in a state apparatus doing the same? Well, in an ironic twist, he's right. He's just wrong about calling that socialism. Yes, the Russians did that. But Stalin did that because he had to give the Russian people something after 10 years. The revolution was in 1917. Stalin becomes powerful in 1927. The revolution has been there for 10 years. The people have suffered tremendously. Remember, they lost the war, World War I. Then they had a revolution. Then they had a civil war. Then they were invaded by 4 countries. They had gone through unbelievable privation. They wanted something to show for it. And he made a decision to call that socialism. Okay, he made that decision. You can argue with it. It's a different matter. But nowadays, we don't need to make this argument. We are not in favor of having a small group of people do that. However, let's be fair to the person who asked the question here. If your number one objective in any society is to stop being horribly poor and to raise the mass of your people out of poverty so they have a decent income, a secure job, adequate medical care, an education for the children, and so on. If rapid economic growth is your number one priority, then the lesson of modern history is don't do it the way the British and the Americans did it, because it took centuries. And don't do it the way the Soviet Union did it, because it took decades. Do it the way the Chinese did it, because they did it overnight. Or to put it in a different way, a hybrid system, this mixture, as in China, of roughly half state enterprise and roughly half private enterprise, gets you a faster rate of economic growth than either of the others by themselves. We now have that experiment having been made. For the last 30 years, the United States has grown at about 2 to 2.5% increase per year GDP. China has grown for that long a period at about 5 to 8% annual growth GDP. Okay, this is unheard of. That's why China is what it is. They have managed to grow in a way that Britain didn't, the United States didn't, and Russia didn't. The irony is, after all the critiques, Russia was the growth story of the 20th century, and China is the growth story of the 21st century, perhaps India now catching up to that. But that's the reality. And India also mixes state and private, not the same way the Chinese do, but it mixes it. And you will get the same designation that Americans are now deciding is the new way to demonize. You are all authoritarians, as you've probably noticed. And this comes from a society whose organization of production is rigidly authoritarian. I tell a joke in the United States that some of you may have heard if you followed my work, that when we got rid of the monarchies in the West, got rid of kings, they were very clever. They escaped our effort to get rid of them. They changed their names, and now they are with us everywhere. We call them CEOs.
Professor, we have time for about 2 more questions, and then we can conclude. So we have a question from the YouTube live chat. Do you think the motto, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, negatively affect economic incentive for work?
It might, I don't know. My guess is that it's not relevant, and here's the reason. The term incentive offers me a wonderful opportunity to represent the notion of overdetermination. Whether you have an incentive to do anything is overdetermined by a vast array of causes, influences, determinations. Let me mention a few. How you were brought up as a child, instilled in you, from your mother or your grandfather or whoever were the closest people to you. A notion of what it was good to do and what it wasn't. And whether you wish to or not, you carry that in various parts of your brain for your whole life. Sometimes you can talk about it, and you can refer to something you remember from grandpa. Sometimes you wonder about it. Why am I driven to do X? And you can't answer the question, but you and the people around you have noticed this in you quite often. And that's part of your incentive structure. You want to please the grandfather who's long gone, but who lives in you in all kinds of complicated ways that human beings have internalized their pasts for as long as they've been human beings. That's part of your incentive. Then there's the incentive of all the people around you now. How will they feel about you if you do this or that? If you don't do that or this? If you're honest, you've been shaped by that all your life. How you deal with your parents, how you deal with your friends, how you deal with your lovers, how you deal with your employer. These are all shaped by all the desires you have of how you wish them to understand you, how you wish them to help you, how you wish them to be close to you. All of these things motivate you. Does your income motivate you? Sure it does. But even the crassest capitalist with just 10 minutes of education in psychology knows that what motivates the worker is not just how much you pay him. In every enterprise that I've ever been connected to, I can show you people who have the same income and completely different work ethics. Look at the language, work ethic. You know what that means? That means your work is governed by an ethic. Another way of saying it, you have some incentives separate from quote unquote economic incentive. It is let me quote Marx when he talks about Malthus. He gets angry, if you remember. Malthus insults the human race. In Marx's word, the human race multiplies like rabbits, but we are not rabbits. Other factors go into our sexual activities, right? We are complicated human beings. To talk about incentives is usually a matter of kind of ignorance. It's a little bit like that story I told about risk. Is there risk? Yes. Do the capitalists take risk? Yes. Is that the end of the story? Oh no. That's the end of their story because they have another goal. They want to justify profit. This is difficult to do. So they came up with risk. Okay? The people who don't like socialism want there to be a notion that it's unworkable. The single most frequent remark, just as an information for all of you, that I receive when I debate people who are conservatives or pro-capitalist, which I have to do here in the United States from time to time. The single most frequent remark, they look at me and they say, well, how can you be interested in socialism? It has never worked. And I remember having to do the work of my own brain. What in the world could they be talking about? What? And then I look at them. In the early days, I would come back and tell them the story of Russia or China, because I thought that would do it. I mean, it worked. China's goal was to stop being the poorest country on earth, and they did it. And they did it in record time. What else could work to me? Then I realized their need was to show it cannot work. They weren't involved in empiricism. They had long ago rejected the notion that Russia was anything other than a total horrible gulag. And we in the United States are busy portraying China that way. And unless Modi changes his politics, they will do the same with him. He will become another Stalin. He just spells it differently. Right? This is about making socialism an impossibility. That's why they will say, you have no incentive. No one will have an incentive. Right? I mean, all I can say is it's an insult to the human being. Nobody I've ever met in my entire life was driven by economic incentive to the exclusion of others. I know no such being. I've never encountered. When I have the debates, I get nasty. I explain to people, for example, that the Nobel Prize is something my colleagues try to get. It's a great prize in economics. Do they have an incentive? Yes. But they're not looking for the Nobel Prize for the money. They're looking for the Nobel Prize because they want to go into the next faculty meeting being the one who got a Nobel Prize because they feel better about themselves. It may be a coincidence, but in my experience, economics professors have very fragile egos, and they need lots of it. And clever university administrators know how to play that game. So they take Professor Dingleberry and they put him on a committee where he is now in charge of something useless, and he can go to a committee meeting and he's in charge and he's the chairperson and the other committee members aren't. Oh, but these are all incentives. At Ivy League schools, this kind of crap is a substitute. They don't even pay them very well. It's a substitute for money. And their incentive system is so screwed that they buy that. They fall for that. They accept less money, and then they go out and write a paper about how money is the incentive you have to have. You don't. It is a mythology reproduced often enough that it lives in the minds of people as a genuine problem. Let me, by the way, conclude. China now competes with the United States on every major high-tech platform, artificial intelligence, you name it. They didn't get there by financial incentives. What is it they got there by? They can't give incentives comparable. If the United States could give incentives, it would have incentivized itself into the position of dominance it so badly wants. It couldn't do it. Turns out it's not, doesn't work.
Yeah. Due to paucity of time, we have room for one more concluding question. Professor, throughout your talk today, you have mentioned about how Marx didn't want us to be fooled by this false immortality of capitalism. You talked about master and slave gone, lords and serfs gone, and employers and employees to be gone soon, hopefully. The highest number of questions that we received on were about this particular theme on the present and future sustainability of capitalism. So, despite everything that is wrong with capitalism, people have asked that its tenacity seems impossible to escape. It often feels difficult to imagine a future without capitalism. How has capitalism managed to continuously avoid its demise and perpetuate itself? Do you think the global catastrophe of climate change might serve as the death knell for capitalism?
Okay. I think that's a good question. I understand it. It comes up often. I'm also impressed by the tenacity of capitalism. I'm impressed that this system has been able to find ways to survive, find ways to overcome unbelievable catastrophes like the Great Depression of the 1930s, like the two horrific world wars of the 20th century, even like the pandemic that we've just gone through. So I think, yes, there's a quote from Marx that I like. No system disappears until all the mechanisms, all the ways for it to survive have been exhausted. And if the argument is made that we can't be sure at this point that, quote, all the mechanisms have been exhausted, I would agree. I can't be sure. I cannot offer you no such guarantee. Capitalism may outlive all of us. By definition, then, I was about to say I wouldn't be surprised, but if it outlives me, my surprise will no longer be registered for anyone to notice, including me. I also would say that capitalism, by comparison to feudalism, is rather young. It's only a few centuries. It's not a thousand years. The conventional registration of feudalism is roughly 500 AD to roughly 1500 AD. I mean, you can argue with it, but that's 1,000 years, not, capitalism born in the 17th century, maybe the 16th, but probably the 17th. So, we're half that, more or less. So we have some time to go. On the other hand, capitalism, as everyone has noted, Marx included, is very technologically dynamic. It produces and rejects technology faster than we have seen before. It's not the caricature that earlier stages were technologically stagnant. That's never been true. That's the hubris, the imagination of people who love capitalism. That isn't the case. But it changes things terribly fast. It doesn't preserve because it can substitute in a way that other cultures haven't been able to do. They had to learn to preserve because they couldn't substitute the old with the new. So they were much more respectful of the old, much more respectful of getting along with nature, much less with this idea of controlling nature, overcoming nature, subduing nature. That's much more cohabiting with nature. And that's very dangerous because of the climate effects, because of all the other natural degradation that we have had. I certainly don't think that the climate thing by itself is the problem. No. But that's because I'm not an essentialist. I'm an overdeterminist. The end of feudalism didn't come because of X. Was there a problem that they ran out of wood? Yes. They cut down all the I'm exaggerating, but they cut down the forests of Europe, and then they had no more forests, and they needed the forest. But they found a substitute. They learned how to make cement, and they learned how to make other products, plastics out of petroleum, and so on. And capitalists are now learning how to make green products, at least to some extent, and they will be forced to do it more, and there will be catastrophes along the way. I get all that. But no, my guess is that capitalism will go when you have a coming together, an over-determination of the external and the internal. Great power conflicts of the sort you see emerging in Ukraine and in the Middle East now, intertwining with domestic explosions of the old class struggle kind, and the climate, and now the global South demanding a place in the world that they always wanted, but are now in a position to get. Well, you put all those together, you have the ingredients for a generic fall down. Here's the irony, but it's not an irony for Hegelians. The system is very powerful, and the system is very fragile. And those two statements are true at the same time. At the same time. In the West, you will hear only how strong. And among people who don't like the system, you will have a tendency to exaggerate the fragility. The truth is, they are both. And how that tense unity of opposites evolves, that's the question. And that's for where we come in with our thinking and our acting to shape it in certain ways. It comes up, a last point, it comes up with trying to understand, and this is for many of you perhaps important, the BRICS. So the mainstream in the United States dismisses the BRICS as of no consequence. China is so different from Brazil, and those are different from India, and that this is a mariage de convenance, the French would say, a marriage of convenience for a while. It's unstable. The 6 countries that joined make it more unstable, blah, 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 blah. And then on the left, you have people who think, it's the end of Western imperialism. Well, not quite. No, not quite. Yeah. But that's okay. That's what happens. It's our job, and it's the contribution we can make to find the validity, the truth in both of those perspectives, to be able to say and to elaborate that it is Charles Dickens on the eve of the French Revolution. If you ever pick it up, Tale of Two Cities, it begins with the greatest passage Charles Dickens ever wrote. It was a time of wealth. It was a time of poverty. It was a time of growth. It was the whole first paragraph is a study in Hegelian opposites. He sees them all and he makes it his menu for the book then to elaborate how, so that when you finish The Tale of Two Cities, you understand that paragraph. But you understand it in a much richer way. There it is. That's the recipe. Face the contradiction. Don't run from it. Don't think that the problem is to solve what was the key variable. There is no key variable. The trick is to understand the contradictions. And when you do that, you end up with a different analysis. And the system that fears that, that's the system that's going to die. I hope this has been clear and useful. I learn every time I'm confronted with questions like this. I'm immensely moved that you are interested in the work that we do. And as I hope Shahram has told you, if you want to do this again or work out a way to do this, I'm at your disposal. This is what I worked to produce. Your interest is my reward.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
very much. I'm going to cut off at this point. Believe it or not, I have a television interview I have to go and do. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Professor Wolff. Thank you so much, Professor Azhar, for joining us today.
Thank
We
you
would like to hear.
Tathagat. That was amazing.
Thank you. And we would like to hear some concluding comments from you as well, as words of encouragement for young scholars in South Asia who want to
Yes.
engage with critical
I
economics.
just wanted to say that this is the first of many series of lectures that we're thinking about. And the Association for Economic and Social Analysis, which publishes the journal Rethinking Marxism. This is the institution that Professor Wolff and Professor Resnick founded 4 decades ago. And it is an institution that is your institution. And for students who are interested in this kind of research, this kind of teaching, and producing these kinds of ideas, shoot me or Tathagat an email, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you so much, Professor. We wholeheartedly express our gratitude to everyone who joined us for today's lecture. I apologize for the questions that I was not able to pick up. I hope it was as insightful and engaging for you as it was for us. Feel free to provide feedback to us in the comments section. Thank you so much, everyone.